Loving one person is one of the most powerful things you can feel. The promise that comes with it, one partner forever, feels like the most natural thing in the world. Most of us never questioned it because the people who raised us never did. Religion turned it into commandment, law turned it into contract, break it, and it ends marriages, shatters families, follows people for years. But when scientists examined ancient human bodies, hormones, and the earliest human groups, what they found did not match the promise at all. And it starts with something almost nobody knows we lost: a small bone sitting inside the body of nearly every male mammal on Earth that somewhere along the way disappeared from us completely. Let's start with that bone, because once you understand why it's gone, the rest of the story falls into place around it. Most male mammals, including our closest primate relatives, carry a small internal bone that supports prolonged mating, useful in species where males need to physically outlast rivals during the act itself. Humans are one of the only primates that lost this bone entirely somewhere along our evolutionary path. Researchers who study this loss point to something specific. Mating encounters likely became shorter, and something else rose to take that bone's place: an early form of pair bonding, where a man didn't need to outlast a rival physically, because he had already built something more lasting with one partner. Our bodies carry the absence of that bone as evidence. Something was traded away, something else got built in its place. So scientists went looking for the rest of the answer, not in old books or moral arguments, but in the body itself, in the space that bone left behind. Here's the pattern researchers noticed among primates first. In species where one male generally pairs with one female, and there isn't much competition for mates, like gorillas, males tend to be dramatically larger than females, but their bodies invest very little in traits tied to direct mating competition. There's simply no evolutionary pressure pushing that direction. But in species where several males regularly compete for access to the same females, like chimpanzees, evolution pushes hard in the opposite direction, favoring traits built specifically for that competition. Now here's the part that surprised researchers. When they placed humans on that same spectrum, we didn't land anywhere near gorillas, the strictly paired species. We didn't land anywhere near chimpanzees either, the highly competitive one. We landed somewhere in between, a pattern scientists now describe as mildly competitive, more flexible than lifelong pairing, but far from the free-for-all some people imagine when they hear that word. Bones and bodies tell part of it, genetics tells another part, and this is where it gets genuinely strange. Every person alive carries two very different genetic trails. One comes down through the mother's line, called mitochondrial DNA. The other travels down strictly through fathers, carried on the Y chromosome. Around 2004, geneticists compared how much variety existed in each of these two trails across large populations around the world, and they noticed something that didn't add up cleanly. The variety passed down through women was noticeably higher than the variety passed down through men. That gap tells us something real about the past. It suggests that across long stretches of human history, a smaller number of men fathered a larger share of children compared to how many women became mothers. Put simply, more women historically passed their genes forward than men did. Some geneticists studying this pattern have suggested that periods where a handful of men had children with multiple women, while many other men had few children or none at all, were common enough in our past to leave this exact signature buried in our DNA today. That doesn't prove lifelong pairing never existed. It does show pretty clearly that it wasn't the only pattern our ancestors lived by. Now, let's step outside the lab entirely and into the anthropological record, because this is where things get even messier and, honestly, a lot more human. Throughout the last century, anthropologists traveled the globe documenting marriage customs, and one landmark reference work, compiled from field research across more than 1,200 documented human societies, from small hunter-gatherer bands to sprawling agricultural civilizations, found something surprising. The overwhelming majority allowed some form of a man having more than one wife, at least for those with enough resources to support it. Strict, exclusive, lifelong pairing enforced across every level of society turned out to be closer to the exception historically, not the universal rule most of us grew up assuming it always was. But here's the twist, and it matters a lot. Even in societies where multiple partners were allowed, most ordinary people still ended up living with just one, simply because supporting more than one household took enormous resources. Only a small slice of wealthy or powerful men could afford it. So, in day-to-day practice, life for most ancient people still looked a lot like pair bonding, not because morality demanded it, but because survival did. Some anthropologists have started calling this resource-driven pairing. It wasn't a rule carved permanently into human nature. It was often simply what most families could manage. And this is where the old written record lines up with the biology in a pretty fascinating way. Religious texts from ancient Mesopotamia describe patriarchs and kings with several wives, sometimes dozens at once. These weren't scandalous outliers. They were simply describing how elite family life worked at the time, while the average farmer or laborer living in that exact same era almost certainly spent his life with one partner, not because a priest or a judge demanded it, but because he genuinely couldn't afford anything else. Around 1750 years before the Common Era, in ancient Babylon, a king named Hammurabi had his laws carved into a stone pillar nearly 8 feet tall, a pillar you can still walk up to today in a museum in Paris. Several of those laws deal with exactly this situation. A man is permitted to take a second wife under certain conditions, but the code spells out in real detail what his first wife is legally owed if that happens: her property, her standing in the household, her children's inheritance rights. That's not a society pretending everyone lived the same simple way. That's a legal system openly built to manage a range of household arrangements that were already common enough to require rules in the first place. So, if flexibility was this common in our past, why does today's world feel so completely built around the idea that one partner forever is simply human nature? A big part of the answer comes down to something surprisingly unromantic: land and paternity. As human societies shifted from small mobile groups into settled farming communities, land and inherited wealth became central to survival itself. A father needed real certainty that the children inheriting his land were actually his. Strict, socially enforced pairing became an efficient solution to that specific problem, not because biology suddenly rewired itself, but because the stakes tied to fatherhood changed dramatically. Religious institutions later wrapped moral weight around that arrangement, turning a practical solution into something closer to a spiritual commandment. Legal systems followed close behind, turning that commandment into an enforceable contract. None of this means people aren't built for deep, lasting love, because we clearly are. When two people bond closely over time, the brain releases a hormone called oxytocin, alongside another one called vasopressin, closely tied to long-term attachment. Scientists have found this exact same chemical pairing in one of the very few mammal species famous for forming lasting bonds, the prairie vole, a small rodent researchers have studied for decades precisely because its brain chemistry mirrors our own so closely. In 2008, that research reached all the way into human genetics. Researchers found a variation in the human version of that same vasopressin gene, and men carrying it reported weaker pair bonds and a rockier marital history than men without it. That's active research right now, studying the exact same chemistry that shaped prairie voles and Bronze Age farmers alike. What the evidence challenges isn't our capacity for lasting love at all. It challenges the idea that strict exclusivity was always the automatic, universal, unbroken rule for our entire species. The honest picture that comes from bones, hormones, genetics, and over 1,000 documented cultures is layered, not a simple yes or no answer. So, when we ask whether ancient humans really had only one partner, the honest answer researchers keep landing on is this: some did, many didn't. Religion still calls it commandment. Law still calls it contract. But underneath both words sits something far older and less rigid than either admits. Somewhere back along that timeline, a bone disappeared from the human body. In the space it left behind, we built something else instead. Not stronger bone, not sharper teeth, but a bond flexible enough to bend without fully breaking, and rigid enough to hold a family together across a lifetime when it needed to. The compromise was already old. We didn't inherit a broken instinct on the days loyalty feels difficult. We inherited that same ancient compromise, one our ancestors were still working out long before any of us were born, and one that still ends marriages and shatters families today. Not because anyone broke some fixed law of nature, but because, in quiet ways, we're still working out the same negotiation they were.